Hello, friends. This is Doug Schaible, and welcome to the Premature Bible Institute. I am a representative for an organization called Ethnos 360, and our job is to reach very remote language and ethnic groups with the gospel of the grace of God. But what do we mean by that, and how do we go about doing that in a way that makes sense to the people that we're going to, and also to the missionaries that are going there? In order to do that, there are things that have to happen, and we'll talk about some of those things at another time. But right now, what we're going to concern ourselves is with how we go about teaching those people. But in order for me to explain those things to you, I think it's important that you are also taught the same way so that you can understand some of these issues that we're going to be talking about. I have decided to do a podcast in which I'm going to teach you the same way that I would teach a tribal person. And I think what you'll find out is it really doesn't make any difference where you're at or who you're at or who you are. It's God is wanting to convey something to each and every individual on the face of the earth. And He wants us to convey it in a way that they understand, that people understand what they're hearing. And so for me, my job is to convey that to we did that, of course, in a tribe. My family and I worked in Papua New Guinea. We were church planters over there. And I'll explain a little bit about that, about the history of all that. But what I want to do is I want to sit down, I want to explain these things to you. And so we've got a series of messages, a series of lessons that are going to be done, teaching the way we teach out in the tribe. And in order to do that, like I said, it's going to take time to do that. And so what I need to do to really explain that well is the first three podcasts are going to be informational. And by that I mean this podcast is going to talk about who I am so that you can understand who I am as a person, what I do, and our history, my wife's and my history, and so on. The second podcast is going to talk about what is my objective in teaching like this. And then the third one is going to be talking about what is the rationale for teaching like this. And this is going to be, we're going to teach you a little bit different than you're usually taught. It's not going to be topical. It's not going to be expositional in the same way you think. What we're going to do is we're going to start at the beginning, and we're going to teach and lay foundations through the Old Testament first in order for us to understand the whole point of this redemptive story. So starting that off then, let's go ahead and start with who am I? Who am I as a person? So that you understand where I'm coming from. I grew up in Kansas. That's where I'm from. Born and raised here, right here in Wichita. Actually, I was born in Hays, Kansas, moved to Augusta, lived there till I was a junior in high school, and then moved to Wichita, which is nearby. And I grew up normal kid, good family, everything. We didn't have lots of money or anything like that. I can still remember collecting pop bottles along the side of the road in order to save money for the family and to help them. It's just a normal blue collar family. That's what we did. My dad worked in the oil fields. My mom worked as an accountant. I've been working since I was 12 years old. Did as a grocer, a sacker. I worked as a dishwasher. I've done everything from working for the phone company as a mechanic. Used to mow big lawns. No, I shouldn't say big lawns, just for the county, that type of stuff. So I've done all kinds of different things. My wife has worked as insurance companies. She's worked for clothing companies and so on. And that's what our life was like. And then we graduated back in the 60s. My wife graduated in 1970. I graduated in 69. And then a couple of years after I graduated, a friend of mine and a friend of Cheryl's who knew each other and were dating had decided that they thought we ought to get together. And so they set us up for a blind date, and I always tell everybody that she was blind and I was the date. And we got together, and it's been love ever since. We've just been with each other since probably July of 1971. So we got married in 1972, and so we've been married 46 years this month. And been a good marriage. We really enjoy each other. I enjoy Cheryl an awful lot. And as you go on, you'll figure out that my wife has done a lot of things that most men would be afraid to do. So, and she, which is so unusual for her personality, she's not a hiker, fisher, camper, hunter, any of that kind of stuff. And yet I've got pictures of her hiking over the mountains of New Guinea, and it's pretty pretty interesting lifestyle for her and for me too. So we were missionaries in Papua New Guinea, but I'll get back to that. In 1977, I had been drag racing at that point. After we got married, we'd been married for about 5 years. And during that time, I'd been drag racing, been doing a lot of winning. Was runner-up at the Winter Nationals one year. And then one day, I got this real strong urge and desire to call some of my old high school buddies, people I grew up with. And so I started calling them and talking with them and had good conversations and so on. And then I remembered one of my friends who lived right around the corner from me, and I thought, I don't know if I want to call him. I heard that he got religion. So, but anyway, I thought, well, he can't hurt me. And so I called Brian up and Candy, his wife, and we made a date to get together. So my wife and I went and met with them and had a nice evening, talked about all kinds of things, ranged all kinds of subjects, even the spiritual. And right before we were getting ready to leave, he was asking me, he says, he says, we've got a revival service going on at church. Would you like to come? And I told him, I says, not really, I don't. And he says, okay, no problem. And so as we were walking out the door, I remember he reached up on the bookshelf and got a book down and handed it to me. He says, hey, would you mind reading this? And I looked at it, and it was a little book called How to Be a Christian Without Being Religious. And I remember thinking, well, that's an odd title for a book. How in the world can a person be a Christian and not be religious? But I told him, yeah, okay, I'll go ahead and read it. And so I took it home, put it on the shelf, and forgot about it. And then forgot about them also. So we were going along, and a couple months later, I got this real strong urge to call Brian and Candy back up. So I called them up. We made a date to get together, and I no sooner hung up the phone, and I thought, oh, he's going to ask me if I've read that book. So I thought, well, I'll take it to work with me. I was working third shift, which is 11 at night till 7 in the morning. I thought if I get any time, I'll start reading it. And if I read a couple of chapters, at least I can say I did that without lying, So I took it to work with me, and as things worked out, I basically worked for a couple hours, and then I had 6 hours to sit there and do nothing. So I started reading that book, and I read the whole book through that night. And I thought, what? But no, wait a minute. I said, I've never heard any of this stuff before. And so I took it to work with me again this next night, and I did the same, and the same thing happened. I read through the book the second time, and I became a believer as a result of that. And the book was just a little commentary on the book of Romans, which is in the New Testament. And so I read that book, and I got saved as a result of that. And I called Brian up, and I says, hey, listen, I just want you to know I became a believer last night. And so that started the process out. And I knew he was going to be a missionary overseas somewhere. And I remember thinking at the time, I said, I wonder why he wants to do that. So I started studying God's Word about how he viewed the world. And the more I studied, the more I became convinced that God wanted to reach a lost world. And so if he wanted to do that, then so did I. And so I wanted to be a missionary. But the only problem I had is my wife wasn't a believer yet. Now, both of us had grown up in religious homes and stuff. And I don't mean that not to disparage what little I'd learned before, but I just didn't understand it. It never made sense to me. And so I worked on Cheryl. I tried to help her to understand these things, and it was very frustrating for me because it was so obvious to me, but it wasn't obvious to her at that time. And then a couple months later, I remember I was getting ready to go to work at where I was working at the phone company. And I just set her down. I said, Cheryl, I says, I don't want to die and know that I'll never see you again. And she got all choked up and she said, yeah, I want to be a believer too. So she became a believer that night. And then we started that for the next year. We studied and grew and so on. And then a year after we became believers, we started Bible school. But we went to Bible school with the purpose of being missionaries. And so we went through the training. It took us a while to get there because there were different things that were coming up during the training, but always had that focus that we wanted to go overseas somewhere. And so we finished the training, and then in January of 1991, we headed to Papua New Guinea, which is where we wanted to be missionaries. And so we went to Papua New Guinea, and we were there. We got acclimated to the country. We learned the trade language, which is Pidgin English. I'm going to change that. I've used that term trade language for a long time. I'm going to call that a transitional language. The transitional language, because there's a transition between me going from English to a tribal language, and that transitional language is like Pidgin English would be in New Guinea, Spanish should be in South America, it could be Swahili in Africa or wherever, what country you're in. It's whatever that is a common language that's used to talk to each other through whatever means they have. And so we learned that, then we did survey work, we went and helped missionaries building their homes and so on. And we did the survey work, and then we found there was a tribe that wanted missionaries to come into them, and so we did a survey into that tribe, and so we decided to go into that particular one. We had some partners, the Shartners from Canada, and we went into that tribe, and we started that process. Well, it wasn't very long after we went in that the Shartners, the wife, she had to go home to have her baby, and she almost died having the baby, and her husband Laurie, he had some health problems, and he had to go back too. And so that left us without partners for about a year. And then about a year later, another family, the Wolves, came in. And so now we had partners. And so we were all learning language and culture and trying to learn that so that we could one day teach them this redemptive story, but do it all in their language. We don't do any of our work except in the language, the local language of the people. So we don't do it in a trade language or a transitional language. We don't do it in English. We just do it in their tribal language. So when I went in there, I was the first white man in the history of their world who had ever learned their language. And I still know it to some degree. If I had, I'd have to go back over and get caught up, but I could do it. So that's what we did. And we were doing that until we learned the language. We were able to develop Bible lessons. We were able to translate scripture and so on to teach them this message in their language. And we got to do that. Taught them from the beginning, from Genesis 1 all the way up to when Christ went back to heaven and so on. So we did all of that, and then we had to come home because we had family members who were dying that we had to come back and take care of. And so we came back to do that, and we were here for a couple of years. And during that time, our agency asked us if we would be representatives, if we would be mobilizers, recruiters, if you want to put it that way, to find people who would like to do this type of work. And so we said we would do that while we were home during this time. But as the time got on, it seemed like it really clicked. And so I even had people from the field suggesting that we ought to do what we're doing because they just said it seems like that's really a good fit for you. And so we started that process of trying to find people, young folks who would want to give their lives to reach those who have never heard. And so that's what we've been doing up until now. We've been doing it for 18 years and doing that. But it's been great to see some of the young folks that we've been come into contact with and help them to understand what they're getting into and help them along the way. And now they're overseas reaching language groups that have never heard before. So we're very, very grateful to be a part of this. So this is kind of who we are. This is who my family is. I've got 3 children, 4 grandchildren now. And I think I've still got another language left in me, but that's up to the Lord whether He would let me try that or not. And even if I couldn't make it, that's all right. I still feel like I've got the heart to try. I may not have the body anymore or some of the stuff that you need. I mean, youth does have its advantages, energy and being able to do things that you might not. Mentally, I feel like I'm still there. I'm 66 years old now, or 67 years old now, and just feel as energized as possibly can be. I always tell young folks, I says, the reason the Lord sends me to people like you is to show them someone my age who's more excited about the Lord than they are. And so we want to be involved, we want to be there, and we want to do this work well. So I thought if there ever came a time where I couldn't drive and do and go to all the different places that I go, and I do spend a lot of time driving and finding students and so on. If there ever came a time where I couldn't do that anymore, where I just physically couldn't do it, how could I stay engaged with people? How could I stay and keep them going and help them understand? And so this is one of those steps. It isn't that I'm stopping doing what I've been doing. It's I'm adding this to that. So what I'm trying to do is to help people to understand what we do and why we do what we do. I always tell people 3 things I'm trying to accomplish that I feel I've done a good job is when people understand who we are, not me, but as an agency, who we are, what we do, and why we do our work the way we do it. This, what we're doing, is why we do our work the way we're doing. This teaching from beginning to end, that's why we do it, is so that people truly understand who God really is. Some of you, I know, most of you are probably going to be believers that listen to this. Some of you are young. Some of you have more knowledge than other people, and that's okay. I think the teaching that we do, the type that we do, helps fill in gaps for people that need those gaps filled in. For some, it's just foundational for them. And for other people, they may not know this story at all. So what I'm going to be able to do is share, this is why Christians believe what they believe. This is why we do. And it's the story. It's not that we're trying to make people believe anything. We're just telling the story, and people have a choice whether they're going to believe it or not. So that's who I am. And the next one is going to be talking about what am I trying to accomplish with teaching the lessons like this. And that's going to be the next one. So that being said, I just want to say thanks for tuning in. The audio portion of this will be on my podcast site, and you can listen to that too. And there'll be a couple of ways that you can listen. For all the audio podcasts, you can go to iTunes or you can go to Google Play Music and look up the Premature or just Premature Bible Institute. You can look that up or just Google it and you can find it. And another way too is for the video podcast, it's going to be on YouTube. So if you go to let me put it this way. If you go to my blog site, you can subscribe to any of them in any way. Apple Podcasts, Google Play Music, and the YouTube channel you can also subscribe to. And I would ask if you would, please subscribe to it. And then once I get enough subscriptions, I think 100 of them, then I can have a specific name put up for this particular for the YouTube channel. But just go to my blog site, which is tribalschaible.com. And that is tribalschaible.com. If you just go there, you can find out all that information. You can find out a little bit of history, a little bit about us, what we're trying to accomplish, what we do as a mission. But it also gives you that site on my podcast page. You can listen to the podcast there if you want to, if you don't have a podcast app or if you want to listen to it on your computer. But it also does give you links to all those, a couple different podcast places, and also to YouTube for the video portion of this. And also on the podcast, you can, if you have a favorite podcast app like Castbox or Overcast, you can just look up Premature Bible Institute and you'll find me. So that being said, you all have a good evening and thanks a lot. Bye.